institutions, departments that are hosting this talk. It's really a pleasure to be here. Although I must say my sort of California dreams have all been crushed by this rain and this weather. I was expecting, sun and surf, but you'll just have to invite me back when we get over this rainy season. I also, if you would allow me, like to dedicate my talk today to Tanaka Hideo-san, or as I knew him, Banjo-san, which was the name of his house. Actually, people in the village that I'll be describing today, they often use the name of their house instead of their family name. But I just heard recently that he passed unexpectedly, and he's a person that really informed my thinking about this area and this project, and so I want to dedicate my talk today to him and his memory. So the title of my talk is Nature Interrupted, Affect and Ecology in the Wake of Eruption in Japan. And I'll talk for hopefully just about 50 minutes, not run on too much, and hopefully that'll leave us ample time for some questions as well at the end. So just before noon on September 27th, 2014, Ontake-san, a volcano located in the Kiso Valley region of central Japan, unexpectedly erupted. The explosion launched a plume over 4 miles into the air, producing a pyroclastic flow, a dense mass of hot ash, lava fragments, and gas that raced downhill, engulfing everyone and everything in its path. Local rescue efforts began almost immediately as ash-covered mountaineers made their ways down from the mountain, and Japan's ground self-defense force began to arrive in the village the next day in such numbers that, as one woman put it, the area, quote, looked like a war zone. Over the following days and weeks, the bodies of 57 climbers were recovered. Another was recovered in the summer of 2015, but 5 others remain unaccounted for, and this is even as official recovery efforts have concluded. Given this great loss of life, media outlets across Japan labeled this eruption as the nation's worst post-war volcanic disaster. For residents of Otaki, a village located at the base of Ontake-san, this eruption has cast a shadow over an already precarious life world. Like many rural communities in Japan, the village is confronting the edges of its own existence. A 2007 documentary by NHK, Japan's National Broadcasting Corporation, described Otaki as a cornered village, oitsumerare tamura. And this was in reference to its large financial debt, a sputtering economy, and a dwindling population. Today, residents of the village have only a few economic pathways, and these are mostly related to tourism. One of these is a village-owned ski resort located on Ontake-san, which provides some job opportunities, though these are mainly seasonal, unskilled, and low-paying. However, due to the eruption, the resort opened late for the 2014-2015 season, and it's had trouble attracting customers in subsequent years. Ontake-san erupted onto a landscape composed by the actions and interactions of a variety of elements, but with the actions of humans having had the most impact over the last several hundred years. Since the formation of the modern Japanese state in the second half of the 19th century, projects of natural resource development and exploitation, followed by regimes of conservation, have shaped the landscape in significant ways. So these projects include industrial forestry, the building of dams and other hydrological infrastructures, the establishment of state-controlled national forests, and tourism development. A cumulative effect of these projects has been the emergence of what I call a resource landscape, and describe as a hegemonic conceptualization and materialization of the environment premised on the incorporation of various organic and inorganic elements and energies for intents and purposes that primarily take shape beyond the local scale. So I characterize the resource landscape as both a product of and part of a broader assemblage. Through such a characterization, I point to what Jane Bennett labels the agency of assemblage, in which the affective dimensions of elements, their ability to affect and to be affected, foster a distributive agency in which effects emerge as collective properties, so emerge at higher levels than individual components of the assemblage itself. So viewed in this way, the resource landscape of Ontake-san is an emergent effect of affective relations among heterogeneous elements located at various scales. But I also note, following Baer et al. In their Gens Feminist Manifesto, that the resource landscape, quote, is not preformed, but heterogeneously made through processes of aligning multiple projects, converting them towards diverse ends that include, but are not limited to, the accumulation and distribution of capital. So in this regard, the resource landscape is also the result of more specific agencies that are enacted by particular groups, particularly corporations and governmental entities. Geographer Tanya Lee labels such enactments assemblage practices, and she describes them as the hard work required to draw heterogeneous elements together, to forge connections between them, and to sustain these connections in the face of tension. So in sum, Ontake-san erupted onto a contingent resource landscape that has emerged both through diverse affective relations among heterogeneous elements and through specific assemblage practices that rely on the ongoing incorporation of various elements and their affective capacities. And yet, while this seemingly stable form of the resource landscape has become hegemonic, I suggest that it's not a complete project. Given the distributive agency of assemblage, in which the affective dimensions of heterogeneous elements are never fully predictable or controllable, the potential for novel formations that may cause shifts, often small but sometimes large, is constant. So in my talk today, I consider Ontake-san's sudden eruption as what Sue Ruddock calls a destabilizing moment, in which the seemingly steady compositions of the world are thrown into disarray, illuminating what Deleuze describes as the, quote, often invisible terrain of life. It thus offers generative spaces for alternative compositional trajectories and world-making projects. So specifically, I develop an affective ecology framework to look at enduring sets of relations among human and non-human entities that are both entangled and embedded within the resource landscape assemblage. I suggest that these sets of affective relations are resistive to large-scale resource projects and their resultant resource landscapes, in that they are generative of alternative value templates and subjectivities that are embracing of common life, vitality, and livability. I argue that in the wake of eruption, human actors who dwell within the Ontake-san landscape are engaging with the affective dimensions of ecological relations with renewed attunement to the value of common life. And so to visualize this more, you can imagine sort of two scales at which things are operating, a local scale and then a more regional and ultimately national scale, and I'll speak to that more in a bit. So to develop my argument, to give you a sense of where I'm going to go with this, I first want to offer a deeper account of the affective ecology framework that I'm employing here. So I'm going to throw a little bit of theory at you first. Hopefully it'll pay off at the end. And then I'll introduce Otaki and the larger Kiso Valley region and offer a historical analysis of the projects of resource development that I've been talking about, and then also talk about conservation, which I see as a continuation of these projects, of state projects. I'll then shift my focus to Ontake-san's eruption and consider its interruptive qualities, and specifically I'll look at how human dwellers in the landscape are responding to the eruption in terms of their relationships with environmental elements and their livelihood practices. And I'll also consider the affective dimensions of assemblage components in Otaki that existed prior to the eruption and that have endured despite the emergence of the hegemonic resource landscape. I suggest that in the wake of eruption, these enduring assemblage components and the affective relations and landscapes they foster offer sites of resistance and hope. And they do so by composing alternative forms of livability and world-making capable of increasing the common vitality and joyfulness of the very beings who dwell on and around Ontake-san. So in other words, they resist this tendency to turn everything into economics in a sort of neoliberal manner. Okay, some theory first. Scholars within geography, anthropology, and other disciplines are recently employing concepts of assemblage in order to theorize complex sets of connected components that span what are traditionally thought of as social and natural domains. The term refers to vast sets of connections and relations among a variety of different components that include organic and inorganic entities, institutions, as well as discourses and knowledges. Though similar to how networks are thought of, conceptualizations of assemblage differ in at least two distinct ways. The first is that assemblage highlights action, the practices of pulling things together, as well as the ways in which effects emerge from relationships. And second, whereas network tends to reference hierarchical organization with certain elements always governing others, assemblage references heterarchical organization, meaning that cause and effect relationships among elements shift through time and across space, and that causal primacy is not attributed to any specific type of phenomenon. So this means that theories of assemblage allow avenues for dialectical engagements with the ideational and the material, again, without giving causal primacy to either domain. Okay, so I often am tacking back and forth between the ideational and the material. The concept of assemblage, thus, quoting Anderson and McFarlane, enables us to remain deliberately open to the form of unities, their durability, the types of relations involved. In the case of Ontake-san, assemblage allows for consideration of the coherence and stability of the hegemonic resource landscape, while also attending to various affective relationships and alternative forms of world-making. Thinking through assemblage also offers insights into the nature of agency, allowing us to think of it both as something that can be enacted by particular bodies, so the hard work of pulling things together that I've been speaking of. But it can also help us to think about something that is distributed across components, so is not held in particular single components. As John David Dewsbury puts it, within assemblage, quote, change is not just willed by us humans, but comes about equally through the materialities of the world in which we are just a part, and which, through habit, we encompass in the everyday, ever-changing assemblage of thought, intensity, and matter. Now, this line of assemblage theory draws from the philosophical work of Baruch Spinoza, and particularly his understanding of bodies and affects. For Spinoza, bodies are not defined by their forms, functions, substance, or subjectivity, but rather by their capacities to affect and to be affected vis-a-vis other bodies. Here, a body, as Deleuze notes, quote, can be anything. It can be an animal, a body of sounds, a mind, or an idea. It can be a linguistic corpus, a social body, a collectivity. The affective ecology framework that I developed to think about the interruptive qualities of eruptions brings together insights from assemblage and affect theories, and it's premised on the notion that things are held together through interactions, entailing what geographer Nira Singh labels a relational ontology, so a relational way of understanding the reality of the world. Within this ontology, the focus is on relations and emergences, and the potential value of any body within this approach rests in its capacities to affect and be affected. In other words, to collaborate with other bodies. So in one sense, I'm thinking about how do assemblages come together and how do they gain their power to have effects in the world. Within an effective ecology framework, seemingly stable entities are considered as bodies, manifestations of the effects of processes of composition and decomposition across space and through time. Put simply, within an affective ecology framework, the world is understood to be composed through active interactions, which means it's always, to some extent, unsettled, precarious, and in a state of becoming. Okay, so let me get us onto the ground here and introduce Otaki. So the village of Otaki, characters on the right here, sits in the back of a narrow valley that runs through the mountains comprising the western side of the north-south running Kiso Valley. The region, which covers just under 600 square miles in southern Nagano Prefecture, about 250 kilometers. I'm always trying to switch kilometers and miles in my head. It's 250 kilometers west of the Tokyo metropolitan area, right in the middle of Honshu, for those familiar. The area boasts a steep topography that's made up of Ontake-san on the western side and the jagged Kiso Range on the eastern. And the Kiso Valley, or the Kiso River, which you see here, flows from north to south down the middle of the complex. Tributaries that include the Otaki River branch off perpendicularly to both the east and the west on either side. So in part due to its topographic profile, the Kiso Valley region is relatively isolated. In a country known for its extensive transportation networks, in this regard, the region is very much a backwater. A simple two-lane road and a single train line run along the Kiso River for the length of the valley, which means that access to major freeways and rail lines is limited. You basically have to go north or south before you can get to a major freeway or a rail line. Up in the mountains away from the Kiso Valley, there are no trains and mostly narrow roads. Otaki itself has no train station, nor even a single traffic light, and no convenience stores, much to the chagrin of all the young people in the village. This remoteness contributes to the village's marginal status within the nation and its inability to have meaningfully accessed the economic prosperity of Japan's post-war period of high economic growth. Farming at an economically productive scale, for example, has never been actualized in Otaki. The village's steep terrain, roughly 99% of which is forested, offers scant arable land, and this, coupled with a cold climatic regime that affords little time for growing, has limited the scale of agriculture, and particularly wet rice agriculture has never really happened in the village. So for upland communities like Otaki, tourism has been the received wisdom for economic livelihood in the post-war period. Like many upland villages in Japan, Otaki has been labeled a Genkai Shuraku. This term is variously translated as village at the edge or marginal village, but the term references existential crisis due to severe depopulation, which is fueled mainly by the exodus of young people to urban areas. Otaki's present population stands at just over 700, down from over 4,000 during the intermediate post-war years. And indeed, recently I checked the village website, and you can almost week by week see the numbers dropping off as people pass away. While I agree with other commentators that depopulation is driving Otaki to the edge of existence, I also contend that its marginality has been structured through a history of state control of resources and accompanying projects of exploitation and development, which have transformed local production systems, ecologies, and environments. And so I'll turn to that history next. Intensive resource exploitation has occurred in the Kiso Valley since at least the 16th century. However, it accelerated substantially beginning in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as timber extraction was industrialized under the Meiji government. This acceleration began with the enclosure of common use forests through the imposition of land taxes beginning in 1874. This was part of the larger Hanseki Hokan, or the return of land from feudal lords to the Meiji emperor. Following this, in 1903, was the establishment of the Imperial Forest Administration Bureau, the Teishitsu Rinyakyoku, as well as a series of regional branch offices to oversee forest management and timber production throughout the archipelago. So you can see the regional branch in the Kiso Valley here, for example. In the Kiso Valley, a forest railroad system also began to be built in 1907, and this eventually expanded throughout the entire region, enabling extensive and efficient timber extraction. And trains ran on this rail network up into the mid-1970s. By the end of World War II, forests throughout the Kiso Valley region and many other parts of Japan have been decimated by state-sponsored industrialized forestry, leading one U.S. official writing in 1951 to label the situation a, quote, forest emergency. Demands for timber to support reconstruction efforts in the immediate post-war period led to emergency legislation and the start of large-scale projects of tree planting or afforestation. These efforts, however, were not able to keep up with demands, and so in the 1960s, the national government eased restrictions on imports of foreign timber. Domestic timber markets crashed, and they've never fully recovered. Replanting efforts, however, did not substantially slow down, which meant that many upland areas in Japan entered into an era of overforestation and undermanagement. So sort of counterintuitively, there's too much forest, if you will. As anthropologist John Knight describes it, quote, "For the upland Japanese who actually live next to it, the post-war forest contributes less and less to local livelihoods and is experienced as a hostile force which threatens to make their village settlements uninhabitable." So partly this is just aesthetics, darker spaces, more trees, less open areas, but also ecological shifts with wildlife in particular. So wildlife coming into the village is increasingly an issue. Actually, to the extent that school children in Otaki, they're issued bear bells every fall and spring for their walk to and from school to make sure that bears know that they're coming. So in simpler terms and in also visual terms, it's through this history of state-sponsored industrial forestry followed by heavy planting focusing on carnivorous timber varieties that Japan's domestic forests, and particularly its national forests, have been converted on large scales from diverse mixed ecologies to simple plantation-style ecologies like you see here, sort of two-storied forests without a lot of biological diversity or complexity. Despite the actual ecological conditions of national forests, however, conservation has emerged in the post-war era as the primary mode of management. Japan's forestry agency today touts these forests as national treasures, kuni no zaisan, and suggests that they are managed to maintain various ecological functions for the benefit of the national citizenry. And I'll elaborate on this in a moment within my discussion of water resource development and the way that sort of forests are tied to water. The development and extraction of water resources was another set of projects that took off in the early 20th century and had transformative implications for the Kiso Valley region. At the turn of the century, water was a sought-after commodity for the production of electricity. Japan's first water-powered electricity generating station was completed in 1911 in the town of Yoatsu, just south of the Kiso Valley. The waters of the Kiso River were used to power turbines and produce electricity that was then conveyed south to the city of Nagoya. The station was built by Nagoya Denryoku, or Nagoya Electric, and it was the brainchild of its president, Fukuzawa Momosuke, who is pictured here. This was followed by the building of Japan's first dam-linked electric power station, Oi Dam, located in the town of Ena, just upriver from Yaotsu, and also built under the direction of Fukuzawa. Now referred to as Japan's king of electricity, Fukuzawa's working philosophy at the time was expressed in the term Ikkasen Hito Kaisha, literally meaning one river, one company, or one river for one company. Under this ideological banner, Fukuzawa worked his way up the Kiso River, completing dams and electricity generating stations one after the other. Today, Kansai Denryoku, or Kansai Electric, the last company founded by Fukuzawa, owns and operates a dozen dams and a dozen more electric generating stations all along the Kiso River and its tributaries, and these produce energy for consumption in the Kansai region of western Japan, including the metropolitan areas of Osaka, Kyoto, and Kobe. The social and political ground for developing water resources in the Kiso Valley was prepared through a long history of state control over forest resources, what I had just described, and institutional frameworks of management established by the imperial government, along with infrastructural investments and material incursions into the physical environments, solidified these transformations so that an imagined landscape of resources was bit by bit crafted into a material reality. Water resource development in the Kiso Valley not only contributed to, but also occurred within the emergent reality of the resource landscape. The construction of dams, which were acts that drew meaning at a national scale, were said to be for the benefit of the national citizenry, and thus took precedence over the concerns of local people. Waters and forests had become national resources and were conceptually linked to a newly imagined national citizenry. Right? We need to remember here that in the Meiji period, there's all sorts of state-making projects that are going on to sort of tell people what it is to be a Japanese citizen. The history of hydroelectric development in Otaki and the rest of the Kiso Valley begins to reveal the linkages among conceptualizations of natural resources, capital accumulation, and the nation itself, as well as the power of this assemblage to conjure landscapes and to physically transform material environments. In early 20th century Japan, modernization was very much a national project, and one that resource governance scholar Jin Sato notes gave rise to the resource concept, which was accompanied, quote, by awareness of the finiteness and shortage of means, i.e. resources, notions that were both attached to national, not local, interests. Within the ideological thrust of this assemblage, conscripting forest and water resources to produce electricity were noble undertakings, and at a national scale, the loss of forest lands in peripheral communities like Otaki was more than justified. The resource landscape assemblage further solidified in the post-war period with the building of this dam, known as Makio. And this was a project that took shape as conservation and forest management emerged as the center of forest agency aims, ideologies, and practices. The dam was the capstone of Aichi Yosui, a project funded by the World Bank and modeled on the Tennessee Valley Authority as a way to foster Ryuiki Minshuka, or watershed democratization, through technological mediations that would enable water from the Otaki watershed to be delivered or democratized to drought-prone communities in Aichi Prefecture to the south. As water development projects like Aichi Yosui came into being, forest lands in the Kiso Valley were recast as suigenchi, or source water lands, which helped conjure a landscape in which forests, waters, and human communities were assembled together under the banners of development, modernization, and democracy. Within an emergent resource landscape assemblage, conservation has been conjured as a governance strategy whereby the state can maintain control over local environments through an existing network of national forests. And again, so I'm looking at conservation as a continuation of state projects, not as some sort of new sustainable way forward necessarily. There's political dimensions there, in other words. During a 2009 interview, the head of the local forestry agency office in Otaki described the office's mandate regarding the management of the roughly 24,000 hectares, or approximately 59,000 acres of national forest that blanket most of Otaki's hillsides in the following way, and here I translate. Now, perhaps the most important points laid out are what we call functions for the public good, what we might call the foundations that allow national citizens to live safely. Things like protecting water at source water areas. If there is runoff, if soil and sand flow into the rivers, dams will become filled in and they will lose their function. Then water used for rice fields and drinking will be lost. The function of the dam itself will be lost. So we do our jobs in line with this most important point. Forest maintenance so that sand and soil doesn't flow down. Forest maintenance to create those kinds of forests. In this official's assessment, which mimicked agency policies, it's clear that the role of forests in Otaki is to protect dams so they can provide water for the public good and the safety of national citizens. I'm suggesting this is a new sort of imagined eco-function. It's not surprising then that today in Otaki the majority of forest lands are characterized and managed as water and soil conservation forests, or suido hozenrin, which according to the forestry agency function to, quote, provide abundant water and purify the air, which are necessary for life. Elsewhere, the forestry agency makes it explicit that this type of forest making, or shiminzukuri, is, quote, to protect the life or livelihood of the national citizenry, kokumin no seikatsu o mamoru tame. Such ideological linkages between national forests and national citizens presented in the form of natures managed for specific ecological functions, such as the suido hozenrin, I suggest contribute to the assemblage work of bringing together water, trees, people, and the nation to create coherent landscapes. So I'm suggesting here that assemblage of a resource landscape in Otaki and the greater Ontake-san area is one in which value is premised on conversions. Conversions that bear et al. Suggest, quote, sever objects, people, and resources from their context. The idea being that once severed from their context, such things can be circulated and incorporated into larger scale projects, like building a national infrastructure for delivering water. The making of resource landscape in the Kiso Valley has thus entailed incorporations of heterogeneous forms, relations, materials, and energies for projects that take shape beyond the local. As forms and elements are converted to resources, extracted, and consumed, the ecologies from which they were wrested change and leave the various bodies that remain to labor for livability within transformed environments and ecologies. For the humans who dwell in Ontake-san's resource landscape, tourism has emerged, often with the urging and support of the national government, as the primary pathway for maintaining life and livelihood. there's not much else to do as you convert away from industrialized forestry and begin to take up land in dam building projects. In 1961, the Otaki village government received a large compensation payment for lands lost due to inundation for the Makio Dam project. The payment amount was 10 times the village operating budget at the time, and so seeing an opportunity, the mayor and village council members agreed to use the funds to develop tourism infrastructure focused on skiing, which at the time was an increasingly popular recreational pursuit across much of Japan. And indeed, a ski boom in Japan for many years has created an enormous amount of ski hills in Japan, way more than one might think, much more than the US anyway. By 1963, a ski hill had been built using converted pasture lands on Ontake-san's southeastern slope. And though the initial investment was modest, as the national government continued to push rural tourism, Otaki's leaders saw fit to continue expanding the ski hill throughout the latter half of the 1960s, and by the end of the decade had invested the equivalent of millions of US dollars. And they were ahead of the game for sure. They were sort of the only game in town for a long time. Their ski hill was the best, but things have changed. So these investments did initially produce positive results in the form of increased tourist numbers, and thus labor in the village shifted away from industrial forestry to service sectors. And so a number of guest houses, inns, and restaurants appeared, allowing a fair amount of residents access to modest pieces of Japan's post-war economic prosperity. However, with the bursting of Japan's economic bubble in the early 1990s, tourism began to falter. Visitor numbers peaked in 1993, and Otaki's ski hill has since become increasingly unprofitable. Though it's still in operation during the winter months, it has ultimately proved a financial liability, resulting in a large amount of debt. Yet, still today, tourism related to skiing and mountain sports remains the most pervasive livelihood strategy on and around Ontake-san. At the village level, tourist industries continue to shape regimes of labor, increasingly making it more contingent and thus revealing the precariousness of life within Otaki. You can imagine how hard it is to maintain a family, a household on seasonal work for the most part. With the decline of state-sponsored industries like forestry, tourism has become one of the only few viable economic projects, that and working for the village government. However, tourism too is in a state of decline, and village residents now find themselves vulnerable to larger economic trends with few options for maintaining their livelihoods and the life of the village itself. What's more, because Ontake-san had been the central focus of post-war tourism activities in Otaki, its eruption has been particularly devastating to the village's economic health. Since there's no clear sense as to when the mountain will again open for climbing, the future of tourism is entirely uncertain. So to reiterate my earlier contention, assemblage of a resource landscape on and around Ontake-san has increased the precarity of communities like Otaki, cornering them within a broader political economy in which state-making and capital accumulation are central forces. Ontake-san's unexpected eruption on the morning of September 27, 2014 created a disturbance felt at multiple scales, but most acutely at the local. Interestingly, the event was at first little noticed among community members who were not actually on the mountain at the time. The eruption apparently made little sound in the village, and the enormous plume that it produced wasn't readily visible from down in the village. So residents spoke to me of learning about the disaster through Facebook, Twitter, other social media, some phone calls. Those on the mountain, of course, were immediately aware of the eruption. Several mountain lodges owned, managed, and staffed by community members are located near the craters from which volcanic material began to flow at around 11:52 a.m. on that morning. Clouds of volcanic material quickly consumed these lodges, which were then rained down upon by a barrage of ballistic rocks that punctured roofs and pounded the earth. Staff members made frantic calls to the village office to report on what was happening, and so local rescue efforts were thus able to get underway almost immediately, but the loss of human life was ultimately still staggering. In the days, weeks, and months after Ontake-san's eruption, the precarity of life in Otaki came into sharp relief. Given the turbulent financial history of Otaki's ski hill, the village's most intensive and extensive tourism project, residents worried about the possibilities of even making a living in the wake of the eruption. In a December 26, 2014 greeting posted to Otaki's official website, the village mayor conveyed his thoughts on the challenge of the moment. And here I quote or translate. Depending on conditions, it can be assumed that this eruption will be a prolonged natural disaster. My thinking is that all residents together should seize this moment to convert our ways of thinking and rise to this new critical moment where we must consolidate our wisdom and aim towards new initiatives. Ontake-san's eruption occurred within an ecology assembled as resource landscape and dominated by market ideologies, resource commodification, and exploitation, as well as a conservation regime premised on ecoservice logics. However, embedded within the assemblage, marginalized but enduring, are affective ecologies and accompanying landscapes that are enlivened through sets of relations among human and non-human entities, as well as subjectivities premised on the value of common life. Ontake-san's eruption can also be thought of then as an interruption, one that has destabilized ways of being, troubled souls, and posed problems, thus opening spaces within which to recognize and reaffirm, as well as to envision and enact ways of living that are premised less on the logics of capital accumulation and more on attentiveness to the interconnections that make life not only possible, but also vibrant and joyful. Although human labors and subjectivities that are informed by affective qualities did not begin with this eruption, within its interruptive moment they are being noticed and attended to as human residents engage with what Onatsin calls precarious living. Labor related to Otaki's tourist industry takes place at the heart of Ontake-san's tensioned ecologies. It's labor that has connections to the mountain status as a sacred landscape, and I'll touch on this more in just a moment. But it's also labor that provides income and is valued according to capitalist logics. Indeed, many, if not most, village residents recognize that tourism related to Ontake-san is key to maintaining their current livelihood patterns. And yet, given the precarious state of Otaki today, with its limited economic potentials and declining population, maintaining the status quo is likely not a promising way forward. So in the wake of eruption, questions of how to do tourism in a sustainable manner are pressing. And there seems to be a clear recognition of the precarious ties that bind village livelihoods to larger tourist trends. Put simply, within the current stabilizing moment, the future remains uncertain for those who dwell within Ontake-san's landscapes. Imagining and enacting a livable world that is not fully dependent on the whims of tourist populations is a difficult project in Otaki. However, the affections that inform social and ecological relations provide ground from which these imaginaries might spring and be cultivated. Labor and energy poured into rituals to maintain linkages between communities of being, human, non-human, and spiritual, as well as new forms of tourism practice attuned to the affective dimensions of emergent ecological assemblages, are examples of the affect-laden practices that continue to enliven the Ontake-san landscape in the wake of eruption. So as I move towards the end of my talk, I consider these two sets of affect-laden actions, and I suggest that they offer ways of being that constitute and reconstitute vibrant ecologies that allow for common life. Thus, even as the disturbance of Ontake-san's eruption appears to threaten life across the landscape, creating uncertainties and precarity, I hope to highlight how lines are being composed from which may emerge alternative forms of livability and enlivenment. In July 2008, I joined with others on the summit of Ontake-san to participate in a mountain opening ceremony known as Kaizanshiki. Among those who gathered for the ceremony were the mayor of Otaki, members of the village council, inn operators, tour guides, and even officials from Japan's National Forestry Agency. Mountain opening ceremonies were performed every year on the summit of Ontake-san up until its eruption. And since that time, ceremonies of prayers and offerings to those who perished in the eruption are offered at a lower elevation. Mountain opening ceremonies entail a set of rituals in which Shinto priests offer prayers and gifts to the god spirits, the kami, that reside in the mountain. And the offerings include rice wine, sake, fish, vegetables, and pounded rice cakes, or mochi. Once these initial prayers and offerings have been made, representatives from various groups take turns offering sacred sakaki branches, clapping and then clasping their hands in prayer and bowing, And I always found it intriguing, for example, to see the National Forest Agency official offering prayers and bowing to this sort of remote mountain god, which is sort of not part of the larger pantheon of state Shinto, for example. After the Kaizanshiki in 2008, while we were having lunch, a Shinto priest explained to me that the main purpose of the rituals was to maintain good relationships with the mountain god spirits. This was important, he noted, because people in Otaki depend on Ontake-san for their livelihoods and their well-being. The mountain provides water and soil, spaces for recreation and religious practice, as well as spiritual sustenance, both to local community members, but also to pilgrims who come from across Japan. I heard similar sentiments from village residents on various different occasions. For example, at the beginning of an October 2008 meeting focused on village revitalization, the head of a local murazukuri, or village-making group, stated that, quote, Otaki is a village that has walked hand in hand with the history of the sacred mountain Ontake-san. I don't have time to get into that longer history, but if there's interest during the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk more about what we might call sort of the sacred ecology that exists on the mountain. The annual mountain opening ceremonies and the thoughts that were shared by village residents point to a local level reality in which Ontake-san and its surrounding landscape are enmeshed within a relational ontology premised on reciprocal interactions among human, non-human, and spiritual bodies. Prominent within this collection of spiritual relations is a pantheon of god spirits that inhabit and enliven the mountain landscape. Human actors rely on god spirits to enable livability and to prevent calamities, as well as to maintain the order of nature itself, and thus gifts in the form of offerings and ritual activity allow humans to reciprocate. Unlike in the status and capitalist projects that I described previously that have shaped the area's ecological assemblage as a resource landscape, wherein value is produced largely through material and conceptual transactions that disconnect bodies from one another so that they can be plugged into exchange networks and consumed as commodities. Within this ecology of reciprocal relations, value arises through the affective capacities of bodies to connect with and to be influenced by other bodies so as to increase the scope of their existence. So the mountain is central to the lives of the people, and the people, their lives are central to the existence of the mountain. Within an affective ecology's framework, the potential value of any body rests in its capacities to affect and be affected, and it's thus realized through its interactions with other bodies, which in turn increases the integrity and vibrancy of the ecology as a whole. And I suggest that mountain opening ceremonies and other forms of reciprocal action among human, non-human, and spiritual elements of Ontake-san's sacred landscape can be viewed as practices of attentiveness. Human actors are giving attention to what endures and what may emerge amidst disturbed landscapes and ecologies with an eye to how livability and common life can be maintained. In the destabilizing moment opened by eruption, this ongoing attentiveness offers insights and lines of articulation in which alternative world-making projects may take flight. Sorry, I skipped over a slide there. So there's some of the components of that relational ontology that I just spoke of. On September 14th, 1984, almost exactly 30 years to the day prior to Ontake-san's eruption, another unexpected disaster struck the area. A magnitude 6.8 earthquake shook Otaki, dislodging an enormous slab of earth and rock from Ontake-san's southeastern slope. The ensuing landslide tore its way to the bottom of the Otaki Valley. Debris covered a portion of the Otaki River up valley from the village's central hamlets, forming a natural dam. The pooling water there created a lake, which was later dubbed Shizenko, meaning nature lake, in reference to what was seen as its natural formation. I never really liked the name, but there you go. Shizenko exists as an emergent ecology, a rapidly developing ecosystem nested in an older established one. On the near shore, the lake is a young forest comprised mostly of fast-growing broadleaf tree varieties, while on the far side there stands a much more mature mixed forest where cypress and cedar trees tower above a lower story of deciduous varieties. The younger forest sprouts from a flow of dirt and debris left after the earthquake and landslide. And so mixed in with the trees are twisted strands of metal from a guardrail that once lined the existing road. There's also a concrete tunnel that sits adjacent to the lake, slowly being consumed by the forest. A hot spring inn that sat in a canyon leading up the face of Ontake-san was washed away in the landslide, and so the bodies of several individuals also remain part of this new ecological landscape, buried somewhere in the debris. 4 years after its formation, Shizenko was little thought about among village residents and almost entirely unknown outside of Otaki. But this began to change in 2004 when Ninomiya-san, or Kin-chan as his friends call him, a man then in his 30s who had moved to Otaki to work at the ski hill, devised a plan to begin leading kayak tours on the lake. Sometime earlier, the village government had used grant funds to purchase a bunch of kayaks, and they sort of shoved them somewhere and never did anything with them. And so it wasn't until Kin-chan, who was a outdoorsman with a sense of people's desires to encounter environments in close and intimate ways, began exploring and gaining an intimate knowledge of the Shizenko landscape, that things changed. Some landscapes lend themselves to the aloof gazing of observers. Yosemite Valley with its enormous walls of granite, or Japan's Kamikochi highlands, which offer sweeping views of some of the Hida Range's most beautiful highland cirques, are landscapes that come to mind. Shizenko, however, is not such a landscape. Rather, its beauty and grandeur come only from patient exploration and observation. The lake invites intimacy, and it's resistant to those unwilling to engage it, both physically and mentally. There's no overlook for the lake, no viewing it from afar, and in fact, much of it is hidden behind bends of trees or within vertical canyon walls. If you didn't know it was there, you would kind of just drive past it. The landscape is thus defiant of the insouciant looks of passers-by. And Kin-chan understood that in order to gain any sense of Shizenko, one must enter the lake and sit directly upon its waters. Before taking me on a tour in 2009, he explained that kayaks are tools well suited to such an undertaking, as they allow interaction with the land waterscape in a way that's deeper and perhaps more even or equitable. And taito in Japanese was the term that he was using, a sort of more equitable relationship. With this philosophy in mind, Kin-chan started offering kayak tours. Business was slow at first. He told me that people would get nervous as they would drive out because it's quite far from the rest of the village, and so he had to put up signs saying, "You're almost there, you're on the right track, it's okay, you'll be fine," so that people would feel at ease. And indeed, word began to spread about Shizenko tours with the help of Kin-chan's an active online presence in both a blog and a website, and so customer numbers increased. Within a couple of years, he was able to quit his winter job at the village ski hill and work only summers at the lake. Shizenko's aquatic ecosystem exists as an active emergence, and during his multi-year relationship with the lake, Kin-chan has observed this emergence diligently, crafting a subtle knowledge of its ecosystem. During my tour, when I asked about an aquatic plant that occupied considerable portions of the lake's southern end, he told me it is known as hiru mushiro, which is commonly known as a pygmy water lily. It's just a type of water plant. It's a perennial that grows well in stagnant waters. And he surmised that the plant will continue to thrive and occupy more of the Shizenko ecosystem, helping to create habitat for fish, of which there wasn't much. Because of the way it was created, there wasn't sort of fish naturally in the area. And Kin-chan's careful analysis was impressive. I noted at the time that those with a shallower understanding of the lake's ecology might try to eradicate the seemingly noxious weed, because it's not particularly beautiful if you're going to take a tour on the lake, for example. You don't want people paddling through this sort of ugly-looking weed. During his tours, Kin-chan speaks on various aspects of the lake and its ecosystem, though he doesn't do so in an overt way. He tends rather to speak as objects come into view or as questions arise. And he explained to me that he also values the lake's silence and the physical sensations that it offers guests, stating that, quote, "It's important for guests to have time for personal exploration and interaction with the lake too." And the way I think about it, Kin-chan's kayak tours of Shizenko are made meaningful through the affective labors of both he and his guests. Neera Singh describes affective labor as that which, quote, "brings together the mind and the body and involves reason and passion simultaneously." It is labor that builds community and produces sociality and subjectivity. Such labor thus also fosters and is informed by a relational ontology within which abundance, caring, and cooperation are made meaningful and valuable. Shizenko is an ecology that is emerging from within the varied assemblage components of the larger Ontake-san ecosystem, which includes vegetation regimes that have been shaped by human activities, water flows modified by dams and other infrastructures, and movements of animals through habitats that have been shaped through years of forestry practice. Ontake describes assemblages as, quote, open-ended gatherings, and she suggests that they don't just gather life waves, they make them. Such open-ended gatherings become happenings, she further notes, through collaborations that create contaminations. Kinchan's affective labors upon the waters of Shizenko help to bring humans into the open-ended gathering of the lake as it emerges as a new ecology. His guests, many of whom return season after season, are affected, they're contaminated through their encounters with the ecology. Kinchan himself has been contaminated as well, emerging as a sort of Shizenko subject, if you will, from which the other ecosystem components of the lake cannot be separated without disturbance, at least in my opinion. So returning to the question of how to successfully do tourism, which has arisen within the destabilizing moment of Ontake-san's eruption, it seems to me that Kinchan's model of what we might call affective tourism offers one possible answer. Rather than attempting to scale up in order to increase tourist numbers, which frequently results in unintended ecological and economic effects, Kinchan gives attention to and provides spaces for collaboration in which values of abundance and caring are fostered through affective relations. The length and scope of the destabilizing moment brought about by the unexpected eruption of Ontake-san is uncertain. It's also uncertain what life projects may emerge from the moment and when. What is certain, however, is that Ontake-san's eruption occurred within a tension landscape in which divergent life projects are at play. Tsing notes that, quote, far from being a self-enclosed system, capitalism is unable to create most of the skills, relations, and resources it needs to function. Capitalist accumulation depends on converting stuff created in varied ways, including photosynthesis and animal metabolism, into capitalist commodities. Within the Ontake-san environment, projects of capital accumulation, alongside state-making projects, have worked to assemble ecological components in a way that enables their exploitation on a large scale. As I've argued, the resource landscape is a cumulative effect of these assemblage practices, and one that's rendered in part through the continuous work of pulling disparate elements together, and thus forging a narrow terrain of nature politics, and governmentality that compels human actors to also narrow their affective scopes of their labors, so engaging only in minimal tourism practices at the margins of the larger nation-state, for example. However, although the resource landscape and its accompanying modes of assemblage dominate the Ontake-san environment, such projects are never fully established as the only way of being in the world. Given this, Tsing suggests that a challenge of our times is to keep an eye not only on projects that have been expanded to a scale where they are capable of transforming landscapes and ecologies, and while I think that's still important to be critical of these larger projects, Tsing also encourages us to examine, quote, where scalability fails and where non-scalable ecological and economic relations erupt. So in other words, to attune ourselves to the local level and what's happening there as well. In this talk, I've argued that Ontake-san's unexpected eruption has opened spaces within which to recognize, imagine, and enact alternative ways of being in and valuing the world. The death, destruction, and uncertainty caused by eruption have created a destabilizing moment in which the terrain of both nature and politics has again widened, making room for alternative imaginings and actions. In the wake of eruption, human dwellers on Ontake-san have opportunities to engage with the qualities of the relations that enliven ecologies by enabling collaborations with one another, organic and inorganic environmental components, and with God spirits. Through this affective labor, residents have the capacity to further develop ideas and understandings that are capable of producing practices and actions that might open new horizons of possibility and give flight to lines of composition from which alternative worlds may emerge. Given the enduring affective relations that I've described, my hope is that the future life worlds on Ontake-san will be more and more enlivened by values of abundance, sharing, care, and love. Hashtag Valentine's Day. I have to do it one time. By fostering ways of being that resist the commodification, alienation, and marginalization that create precarious living in the Ontake-san landscape, affect-laden practices contribute to the assemblage of ecological communities that are truly sustainable. Thanks. I rambled a little bit, but I think we still have a few minutes for comments or questions. Please.
So public awareness of environmental issues is key to solve those problems.
Mm-hmm.
And in your talk, you said spirituality of things at the mountain, and people are trying to use kayaking to allow others to enjoy the beauty of nature. I think those are ecocentric ways of viewing human connection to nature. So would you say it's more effective to spread the human-centric view of our relationship with nature, or ecocentric way is more effective in terms of encouraging people to actively preserve and conserve natural resources? Also, would you say awareness will only increase after a major disaster?
So let me answer the last part of your question first, which is I hope not. And yet, I think that those moments can be jarring and troubling and disturbing, and so they might open up new spaces in which to think of these things. Most definitely an ecocentric approach to the community, right? Meaning a community that includes humans, but also goes beyond the human, to recognize the importance of ecological relationships at a larger scale, I think is the way forward in terms of resistance to current environmental politics. The problem is, however, that the sort of larger neoliberalization of nature, if you will, that is continually attempting to marketize or to put into economic logics all variety of ecological phenomenon is pushing back against that all the time. And so part of what I'm trying to think about are where are the places for emergent political projects that can resist those sorts of overarching marketization schemes. This idea of eco-functional natures that I only touched on briefly here, but which I look at more in some of my other work, I think is really quite destructive, and particularly as we see it in conservation regimes around the world. If we think about contexts on the African continent, for example, where conservation projects have worked to remove people, right, and to change production systems in the name of sustainability and conservation. I think there's some disconnects that are happening there that fail to recognize the integratedness of humans with their local environments. And so I think an ecocentric perspective is the way forward for sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. Up here.
Okay, in regards to the mindset of commodification that you kind of touched on in your history of Otaki Village, I was wondering to what extent that mindset was in the part of the village residents itself or to the dominance of larger governmental institutions?
Both. And so that's another component of this broader assemblage that I didn't get to speak about today, but the production of subjects, of human subjects. And so in my larger book project, for example, I talk about our inaugural calls it environmentality, the sort of creation of subjects of governance through environmental schemes for protecting environments or something along those lines. My initial insight into that question of how do people at the local level think about these environments came when I started asking people about it. What about these forests? These are all national forests. What do you think about this? I'm doing this project and I want to think about collaborative governance and yada yada yada. And the people locally on several occasions kept saying that the forests were kuni no mono. It's just those are the nation's things. and they don't really concern us because we don't have any say or control. And so I saw this initial disconnect, and I was thinking, well, what's going on here? And so part of my thinking about how a resource landscape emerges is that in that emergence, it also begins to create subjects who can then confirm or affirm that that's a reality. And so, for example, with Makio Dam, there's a whole set of practices now that local villagers engage in with people in downstream communities to kind of celebrate that dam and to think about ways of protecting forests as source water areas. And so I'm sort of concerned with the ways that something like a dam can become settled into the environment, right? And to begin to conceal the history of the really contentious history that gave rise to them. Because people in the village were like, hell no at first. There was Hantai Undo opposition movements all over the place. And they were saying, this is BS, this isn't integrated development and blah, blah, blah that was happening. But now it's just kind of the way it is, right? It's become a reality. I hope that answers your question. And then in the back.
Yeah, so you mentioned that it's kind of interesting to see the National Forestry at the mountain opening ceremony, giving offerings that are not necessarily, I think you said, part of the larger pantheon of State Shinto. Maybe you could just expand a little bit on that dynamic.
Sure. Yeah, so as part of the Meiji government's project of sort of state making, was a consolidation of Shinto shrines across the archipelago, right? And also to use that as a tool for demographic control, or to get a reading on demographics. And so each family was required to register with their local shrine, right? It was sort of one shrine for each community. And so Otaki has that shrine, but up in the mountains, sort of away from the grasp of the state, for lack of a better word, you find all sorts of different kind of localized deities that aren't. So the priests here, for example, they dress in Shinto garb and everything, but the longer history there is definitely not sort of part of the state Shinto. You know, it's not part of the creation of Japan itself, right? You know, getting stirred up out of the waters and so on and so forth. And so there's a variety of different religious traditions that use the mountain and see it as their sort of a spiritual connection or a spiritual mother that include Buddhist sects as well. But the largest one is just called Ontake Kyo, so it's specifically a religious tradition around that mountain, and engage in practices of they call it yorigito, which is possession, basically, spirit possession. So on the summit of the mountain, they will become, the more advanced spiritual practitioners will have gods actually come into their bodies and speak through them. So all of this is sort of out of the parameters of Shinto as it's supposed to be practiced sort of within the state, as it were. And so it's interesting, it was interesting to me to see the forestry agency, which controls so much of the land in the Kiso Valley and then on Ontake-san as well. And in fact, even the village ski hill, they pay rent to the forestry agency for the land that it's on. So to see an official there sort of giving thanks or giving offerings to this very localized god, to me was quite interesting and spoke to I suppose the forestry agency could just be like, whatever, like I'm not climbing to the top of this mountain to give prayers to this god. But for whatever reason, they recognize that that's an important practice for them to engage in. Part of it might be a holdover from the past when there were more of a presence of the forestry agency in terms of people. There used to actually be a whole hamlet in Otaki that was just forestry agency employees. Yeah, to me it seemed powerful. And I'm sort of linking it, I guess, in my mind to other times where people in Otaki are definitely aware of the history of resource use in their valley, and there's sort of moments where they can make critiques of that without sort of overtly challenging the authority of the national government.
And what is the name of the National Forestry? What's that governing body called?
So it's the Forestry Agency, which is part of the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, MAF. Yeah.
I can't quite form a very clear question, but I'm wondering about the concept of the nature in Japan, how the relationship between humans and nature, and also that in a religious context as well. So the Meiji government coming in and meddling, and you talked about disconnect. I wonder if you can talk about that possibly in relation to the gods and the humans in the religious sense. Did people then consider the national, the government that's coming in to meddle with their lives? Is that sort of considered part of the nature almost, as if the natural force coming into their lives that it's beyond their control?
It's an interesting question. I don't know that I have a really good answer to it, although I think maybe it's a little bit of both. Yeah, I mean, there is a recognition, I would say, that things have been done to the landscape, to the environment, that have been beyond the control of local villagers. And so in some ways, there's a sense of, I think, they've kind of been, in the sort of waves of modernization, that they've sort of been beat up on the rocks of it, that, and kind of beaten up that way. But there is critique against it as well, like I was just mentioning. Both at the local level, more recently there have been scholars in Japan that have more directly been making critiques about the forestry agency and the sort of lack of management in the post-war era in particular. Part of the issue has been an initial funding structure that was linked to timber production. And so for the forestry agency, it sort of became, the more trees we can cut, the more agency dollars we get. And so it was in their interest to produce a lot of money, to produce a lot of timber that way. And so the legacies of that are there. One community member, when we were walking in a forest, he said the problem is that the forestry agency just plants kanini naruki, trees that will become money one day. We can cut them down and sell them. The conversion that's happened, though, the ecological conversion because of clear cutting, has actually made growing timber quite difficult in a lot of parts of Otaki. The original timber forests had emerged out of climax forests that were more complex and had biological material to help foster timber varieties. And so in these clear-cut areas, you have the forestry agency just planting hinoki or sawara, other types of cypress trees, and they just don't do well. They're really stunted and they don't do very well at all. So there's an understanding there for sure that the ecology is messed up here, and it's because of the forestry agency. I think more so that people at the local level feel powerless as to how to exactly begin to launch that critique or to become more involved in governance decisions and things like that.
I'm so interested in the fact that the Ontake-san is a sacred mountain, and there are other natural disasters like earthquakes and eruption happening in other parts of Japan too, but this is particularly a sacred spot. So how would you compare what happened there as opposed to Ojima or Kumamoto, where they did have eruptions and landslide and so on? Would you?
Yeah. When I first heard about the eruption, I think I initially wanted people to start speaking about it as something had been done wrong to upset mountain gods. Nobody really spoke that way. I think where it did get tangled and messed up a little bit, unfortunately, was in the national press with how the disaster unfolded sort of in thinking about the disaster at the local level versus the national level. So at the national level, it was quickly nationalized as a national disaster, as disasters in Japan frequently are. And so that meant the loss of life, which of course was profound and tragic. But for people in Otaki, this was earth-shattering, right? And frightening in terms of what are we going to do? How is this going to work? The mayor, when I spoke with him in the summer following the eruption, he said, I had just gotten the village back on track financially. I'd just gotten rid of our debt, and now this happens. And so he was really upset. So he gave a press conference at one point and said, don't worry, we're okay, we're going to be fine. And that quickly got picked up by the national media, and people started giving critiques of the village of, you all are making money with the ski resort and hiking, and you just get to use this land, and these people have died, and now you're trying to tell us that you're okay, but you're profit making off this place. And so it really got sort of read in an odd way. But I think, so sorry, to go to the point about the religious connection, for people locally in Otaki, there's a long history of catering to pilgrims on this mountain, and so they understood that its eruption was now interrupting economically. Sort of, there's sets of villages at the local level, and in the past you would have had mountain huts all the way up the mountain in which pilgrims would stay, and these long-term pilgrimages. They're much shorter pilgrimages these days. You can drive almost to the top of the mountain and you can take the gondola to get almost to the top. But still, those shrine networks and lodge networks are connected with pilgrimage and with these devotees of Ontake. And so I think for people in Otaki, they see part of their duty as maintaining access to the mountain for these people. And so I think that's what they were speaking of. But at a national level, it just came across in a very odd way, unfortunately.
Interesting. So would you say that the sacred quality of Ontake-san is more important for the people who are not living there, and they're more interested in the more immediate issue of economy and the sustaining of their lives?
Yeah, people locally. Yeah, definitely. So there's very few people in Otaki that I think themselves would say that they're devotees of the mountain, Ontake-kyo. So, for example, pilgrims will do taki-gyo or waterfall austerities, standing under a waterfall. People in the village don't really do anything like that. But so they sort of see themselves as caretakers, I think, in a way. And they frequently refer to the mountain as Oyama, just the mountain, and talk about it in really sort of familial ways. It's very much connected to their lives.
Thanks so much for your talk, by the way.
Thank you.
I was really struck by the graph that you showed of the depopulation of this village, Otaki, and also captivated by your stories of the emergence of these kind of affective ecologies, Amitsu's ideas of living in precarity and that sort of thing. Do you see in your conversations with people that this is something that their youth respond to? Is the idea of affective ecology and the religion, is that more among kind of the older population, or is it something that the youth? Is there kind of change in the way younger people in the village might think of how conservation should be done or how natural resources should be governed? Can we see a generational shift in the way people think about nature?
I wish. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing it much, but it's something that I, for a second book project that I'm beginning to do research, not only in Otaki, but some other kind of peripheral communities in terms of their engagement with tourism in particular. I'm starting to think about and sort of look for how, because you definitely do have this kind of I turn, which is a term I don't like because I is straight, it's not even a turn, but which are people from urban areas who are moving to rural communities to explore different ways of living and so on and so forth. And so you do have that. I didn't see a lot of it in Otaki. There was actually Kin-chan, who does the kayaks. He was an I-turn, along with a whole other crew of I-turns that were there when I was there. And sadly, I think it's just the realities of it is as they progress in their life course, get married, have children, begin looking for jobs that are something more than working at ski hill, they tend to leave the village as well. Just most recently, a couple who had gotten married and had 2 children in the years since I've been not living in the village, they saw that their kids were going to be single children in their age grade, so it would just be one kid, first grade, second grade, third grade, and so they made the decision to leave. They just can't hang on to it. So I think it's a really pressing question for a lot of communities in Japan. How do you attract young people? It does, interestingly though, seem like it's an apt time to start thinking more about those things in Japan. Ann Allison, an anthropologist at Duke University, recently wrote a book, Precarious Japan, and talks about the ways that the structures and the institutions that made post-war economic miracle Japan happen are now falling apart, and labor is becoming more contingent, and people aren't getting married, and they're not having children, and the population's in decline. So it seems to me a very appropriate time for people to start exploring some of these other ways to live, because you can do it really cheaply if you go out there. It's just having to think about how are you going to make your living, and that sort of requires people to start thinking in different ways, I think, right? You can't, the kind of government, jobs, and there was a lot of pork barrel spending in the post-war era by the national government. That was the way I see the sort of attempt to maintain a voting populace in the rural communities, and that project seems to be going away as well. So hopefully I can introduce you if you're interested going out to Otaki and or anybody else.
Well, thank you very much. If you have questions, please stand around the
Definitely.
table and we can talk. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much.